It was a packed morning session on Capitol Hill. The House Oversight Committee was in the middle of a high-stakes hearing about federal budget allocations, and tensions were already running high. Senator Tim Scott, known for his measured but sharp tone, leaned into his microphone. He glanced at his notes, then fixed his gaze across the room. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, his voice calm but unmistakably pointed, "you've made some rather passionate statements lately, statements that seem more focused on soundbites than substance." A low murmur ran through the chamber. Cameras zoomed in. Representative Jasmine Crockett, unfazed, sat back in her chair with a calm smile. She was dressed in a sleek navy blue blazer, a gold pin glinting on her lapel. She knew this moment would come. Scott had been circling for weeks, waiting for the right hearing to make a move. Tim continued, "Would you care to clarify your recent comments suggesting that members of this body are out of touch and incapable of governing responsibly? Or was that just political theater?" The air in the room thickened. Even some of the reporters in the back row stopped typing. Jasmine leaned forward, her fingers lightly tapping her binder. But she wasn't ready to fire back, not yet. She was going to let him build it up a little more. Jasmine Crockett tilted her head slightly, studying Tim Scott with a steady gaze that held neither fear nor irritation, just calculation. The room waited in silence, but Scott wasn't finished. "Because if we're going to have a conversation about responsibility," he continued, "then maybe we should start with accountability, something I'm not sure your recent record reflects." A few gasps echoed, followed by shifting chairs. This wasn't just posturing anymore, Scott was going for a direct hit. Jasmine slowly opened her binder. Her fingers flipped to a tabbed page, her expression calm but razor-sharp. She had come prepared, more than Scott expected. She spoke, finally. "Well, Senator," she began, her voice smooth but firm, "I find it interesting that you're suddenly so invested in accountability, considering you voted against nearly every bill that would have brought transparency to corporate lobbying in this country." That was the first jab. And it landed. Tim's mouth tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Jasmine continued, "You want to talk about soundbites? You've built your whole brand on talking points that play well on cable news, but fall flat when it's time to vote." Now the murmurs were louder. Scott blinked, caught slightly off guard. He tried to pivot. "I'm asking for clarity, Congresswoman," he said, "not a lecture." Jasmine smiled. That was the opening she needed. Jasmine leaned in closer to her microphone, her smile tightening just enough to signal that the gloves were off. "Oh, Senator," she said with mock sympathy, "if you're uncomfortable with a little clarity, maybe you shouldn't have asked for it." Laughter rippled through the chamber, quick, involuntary. Even a few aides exchanged surprised glances. She didn't wait. "You sit here acting like a referee," she continued, her voice gaining momentum, "when you've been on the sidelines for half the real fights, silent when it mattered, vocal only when the cameras were rolling." Scott leaned back, lips pursed. Jasmine pressed forward. "You say I'm chasing soundbites? The only thing louder than my words are your absences, absences when women's rights were on the line, when police accountability was debated, and when your party blocked funding for working families." That was the body blow. And she wasn't done. "You want to talk about responsibility? Let's talk about the responsibility you dodged every time a tough vote came up, while people back home were left waiting for leadership you were too busy polishing your image to provide." The silence in the room now wasn't out of respect, it was shock. Tim Scott looked stunned. His team shuffled behind him, whispering, trying to regroup. Jasmine sat back, her hands folded neatly. "Now," she said coolly, "was that clear enough for you, Senator?" For a full 10 seconds, no one moved. Cameras stayed locked on Tim Scott, who was clearly caught between responses. Should he fire back? Change the subject? Pretend it didn't happen? He cleared his throat. "Well," he began slowly, trying to reclaim some ground, "that's certainly passionate. But passion doesn't always equal effectiveness. There's a difference between performance and policy." Jasmine leaned forward again, but this time her tone was colder, more direct. "You're absolutely right," she said. "And the difference is that I don't just show up to make speeches, I show up to vote. I show up to fight for people who don't have million-dollar donors doing their talking for them." Gasps again. She continued, "I'm not here to make everyone comfortable. I'm here because too many folks in this country are barely hanging on, while people in this room argue about decorum." Scott tried to interject, but Jasmine raised her hand, not to silence him, but to finish her point. "You want to talk about responsibility," she said. "Then take some. For once." The silence was suffocating. Tim Scott sat still, jaw clenched, his earlier confidence now visibly shaken. The crowd, journalists, aides, even a few members of Congress, began murmuring louder now, whispering not about policy, but about how thoroughly he'd just been shut down. Jasmine glanced at her notes, then back at Scott. "I yield my time," she said coolly. And just like that, the room exploded into whispers and hurried text messages. Within minutes of the exchange, clips of Jasmine's brutal comeback were already being posted online. One headline read, "Crockett drops the mic on Tim Scott during heated hearing," another said, "Tim Scott gets schooled on accountability," by Jasmine Crockett. Even news anchors who usually avoided controversy were calling it one of the most blistering clapbacks seen in a congressional session all year. Back inside the committee chamber, the chair struggled to restore order. "Let's bring it back to the topic at hand," the chair said, clearly rattled. But the energy had shifted. Tim Scott remained unusually quiet. His hands were folded, his gaze lowered. Every attempt he made to regain footing came off forced, hesitant. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett sat composed, flipping calmly through her notes, as if nothing had happened. As if she hadn't just rearranged the balance of power in the room with one fiery rebuttal. Other members glanced her way now, not dismissively, not patronizingly, but with a new respect. Some even a little nervous. One staffer texted their team, "Crockett just ended Scott. This'll be all over the news tonight." They were right. By the time the hearing ended, #Crockett clapback was already trending. And Jasmine? She hadn't even raised her voice. After the hearing adjourned, reporters rushed into the hallway, hoping to catch a comment from either side. Jasmine Crockett exited first, surrounded by a tight circle of staffers. "Congresswoman Crockett, do you have a response to Senator Scott's criticisms of your leadership?" She stopped, turned to the cameras, and said with poise, "My record speaks for itself. And today, so did I. No shouting. No drama. Just precision." Meanwhile, down a different hallway, Tim Scott was ushered into a private room with two senior aides. The mood was tense. One of them whispered, "We should have pulled back, she came in loaded." Scott sighed and removed his glasses. "She was supposed to overplay it," he muttered. "Instead, she hit every weak spot we've been trying to bury." The aide nodded. "And the worst part? She didn't break a sweat." The clip of Jasmine's shutdown had already made it onto cable news and social media reels. Analysts from all sides, left, right, center, were dissecting it. Some called it a masterclass in rhetorical dominance. Others warned that Scott had underestimated her at his own peril. But the most repeated phrase was one posted by a political strategist on X, formerly Twitter. "Tim Scott brought a memo. Jasmine Crockett brought a mirror." The fallout was only beginning. By the following morning, Tim Scott's team was in full-blown damage control. Talking points were issued. Emails sent to conservative media outlets urged them to refocus the narrative. Friendly pundits were asked to downplay the exchange as heated but inconsequential. But the problem? The internet doesn't forget. Clips of Jasmine's calm demolition had racked up millions of views overnight. TikTok creators were remixing her words into viral edits. Even late-night hosts picked up the moment, replaying her final line, "Take some. For once." Over a slow zoom with dramatic music. Meanwhile, Jasmine was booked on several major shows. Morning anchors greeted her with grins and questions like, "Did you know in that moment you were going viral?" She chuckled softly, always redirecting the conversation back to the actual policy issues. That was the brilliance, she didn't gloat. She kept the focus on her message, not the takedown. One host asked, "You didn't even raise your voice. How did you stay that calm?" Jasmine answered simply, "When you speak from truth, you don't need to yell." Back at the Capitol, staffers whispered in elevators and cafeterias. She flipped the entire hearing with 2 paragraphs, someone said. "Scott's not going to challenge her again anytime soon," said another. Even some of his allies quietly agreed, he'd walked into a lion's den thinking it was a debate. But Jasmine Crockett didn't debate. She dissected in the days that followed, something subtle but powerful began to happen on the Hill. Jasmine Crockett, once labeled by some as too loud, too bold, or too combative, was now being discussed with entirely different adjectives: sharp, strategic, fearless. She was invited into more closed-door strategy sessions. Members who had once kept their distance were suddenly seeking her insights. Even long-serving committee chairs took notice. Meanwhile, Tim Scott's momentum took a hit. His next media appearance was noticeably tamer. Gone were the sharp jabs and confident critiques. He tried to regain ground by discussing policy, but the energy just wasn't the same. One political analyst put it plainly on air, "Scott aimed for a headline and got a headline, but not the one he wanted." Crockett didn't just shut him down, she rewrote the narrative. Back in her district, Jasmine was being celebrated. Grassroots donors flooded her inbox. Volunteers signed up in droves. Constituents called her office, not to complain, but to thank her. She stood up like she was speaking for all of us, one caller told her staff. Behind the scenes, even party leadership took note. A senior strategist pulled her aside after a vote. "You just earned more political capital in 5 minutes than most do in 5 years, they said. Use it wisely." Jasmine simply nodded. She didn't need applause. She had something better now, leverage. While Jasmine Crockett's star was rising, not everyone was clapping. In backroom conversations, murmurs of retaliation began to surface. A few senior Republicans, still stung by the viral exchange, floated the idea of launching a conduct review against her. Not because she broke any rules, but because she made them look weak. "She embarrassed one of our own," one aide was overheard saying. "There's got to be a response." Tim Scott himself stayed largely silent. He didn't publicly address the moment, but behind closed doors, he approved a subtle strategy: paint Jasmine as too aggressive, too divisive, too emotional. It was an old playbook, but this time, it wasn't sticking. The media didn't buy it. Clips of Jasmine calmly stating facts, without yelling, without insults, made the aggressive label look absurd. Even some right-leaning outlets hesitated to push the narrative. And Jasmine? She kept doing her job. She introduced a new bill aimed at increasing transparency in government contracting, just days after the hearing. Reporters asked if it was related to her clash with Scott. Her answer: "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to legislate." That's the difference between making noise and making change. The public noticed. Approval polls in her district jumped. National PACs began to show interest. And the most telling sign? Behind closed doors, a Republican strategist sighed and said, "We tried to make her the story. She made herself the standard." A week later, another hearing convened, this time on national broadband infrastructure. It was expected to be routine, even dull. But observers knew something was brewing. Tim Scott and Jasmine Crockett were once again seated on opposite ends of the chamber. The energy was tense, but calculated. Everyone was watching: staffers, media, political influencers. Not for policy, but for the rematch. Midway through, Scott took the floor. Madam Chair, he said, addressing the room, I'd like to raise a concern regarding the tone and professionalism in recent sessions. Some of our colleagues have chosen confrontation over collaboration. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. The message was clear, he was trying to reframe himself as the calm, rational voice, and cast Jasmine as the disruptor. But Jasmine, once again, didn't take the bait. When it was her turn, she stood up, not with defiance, but with purpose. With all due respect, she said, locking eyes with the room, passion for the people we represent is not a breach of professionalism. Silence in the face of injustice is. The room went still. She continued, if calling out hypocrisy, standing up for working families, and demanding real accountability makes some uncomfortable, then maybe the discomfort isn't with my tone. Maybe it's with the truth. Boom. Even members from the other side of the aisle looked down awkwardly, realizing they'd witnessed not a performance, but a conviction. Cameras rolled as Jasmine ended her remarks, I wasn't elected to blend in. I was elected to stand up. Thunderous applause broke out from the public gallery. One network anchor tweeted, Jasmine Crockett didn't just shut down a narrative. She buried it. Scott didn't respond. He simply gathered his notes and left the chamber, quietly. And this time, no one followed him. By the end of the week, Jasmine Crockett's fiery presence on the Hill had become more than just a headline, it was a movement. Clips of her most powerful lines were being quoted by students, activists, and even late-night hosts. Her words, maybe the discomfort isn't with my tone. Maybe it's with the truth. Were printed on posters, t-shirts, and tweet threads. Young politicians began citing her as inspiration. She received invitations to headline town halls, speak on national panels, and appear on every major network, left and center alike. Meanwhile, a subtle shift was happening in Congress. Staffers began preparing their bosses better for hearings where Crockett would be present. Subcommittees quietly began discussing how to be more transparent, knowing she'd call it out if they weren't. Even some Republican members, privately, began urging Tim Scott to let the moment go. One senior lawmaker told him bluntly, you swung first, Tim. She just swung harder. Behind the scenes, Tim's advisors recommended he avoid further public engagements with Crockett. The optics were too risky. The contrast was too sharp. And Jasmine? She didn't gloat. She stayed focused, deliberate, and always on message. When asked what she thought about becoming a symbol of standing up to power, she replied, I'm not a symbol. I'm a servant. My job is to fight for the people who sent me here, not to play politics with fragile egos. It wasn't just a clapback anymore. It was a cultural shift. Weeks later, long after the headlines faded and the pundits moved on, the moment still echoed through Capitol Hill. Jasmine Crockett had become more than just a viral sensation, she was now a name with weight. Her inbox was flooded not just with praise, but with policy collaboration requests from fellow lawmakers. She was invited to co-lead a bipartisan transparency bill. She'd turned a verbal clash into real legislative momentum. That was the difference. One night, after a long day of votes and meetings, Jasmine stood alone outside the Capitol dome. Her aide approached, holding a tablet. You should see this, he said, handing it to her. It was a clip from a classroom in Detroit. A teacher had played the video of Jasmine's takedown in civics class. The kids were cheering, clapping, even quoting her lines. Especially, I wasn't elected to blend in. I was elected to stand up. Jasmine smiled quietly. She didn't need to say a word. She knew what had happened. She'd stared down a sitting senator. She'd turned a setup into a statement. She'd taken a moment meant to silence her, and turned it into a movement. Back in his office, Tim Scott scrolled past another article praising her rise. He paused. Closed his laptop. And leaned back, staring at the ceiling. He hadn't just lost the argument. He'd underestimated the wrong woman.